Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this episode, I'm exploring human risk in the third sector. That's bodies that aren't public or private sector. In other words, organisations undertaking social activities, like charities or NGOs. What fascinates me about the sector is the combination of risks they face, high-profile nature of their activities, and the constrained budgets they have, which lead to a requirement to be highly innovative. So there's a lot that we can learn from them. My guest, Sabrina Segal, is a lawyer who's been working in the third sector for a number of years. She's one of the most insightful thinkers I've come across and has lots of really interesting stories to share from her experience. In our discussion, we explore how Sabrina came to work in the third sector after beginning her career in law, the challenges the sector faces and how they go about mitigating the broad range of risks they face, whether that's humanitarian charities deploying aid workers into disaster or war zones, or even running a charity in a developed country that simply relies heavily on volunteers. All pose huge challenges from a human risk perspective. Every discussion I've ever had with Sabrina has been insightful and given me food for thought. So I was delighted when she agreed to come onto the show to talk more about her experience and what she's learned from it. Whether you're in the public, private or third sector, I think you're going to find this fascinating. And if you're worried that a serious subject might not make an entertaining listen, rest assured, Sabrina is a lot of fun. So please enjoy my discussion with Sabrina Segal on human risk in the third sector. Sabrina, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to be here today.
I'm really excited to have you here. Look, I know you well, but my listeners might not. So can you give them an intro to yourself?
Sure. I'm a Cancer. I like long walks on the beach. No, so I'm a risk and compliance professional, hopefully with a sense of humor. But my focus is the third sector. So I actually started out, I'm an attorney by training. I'm a U.S. bar lawyer. Please don't hold that against me. But I didn't really want to go work at big law firms. I didn't want to help people argue about money or stuff or anything like that. And so I started out my kind of professional journey in the government. I worked with the U.S. Department of State and then with the USAID, the Agency for International Development. And I always knew I wanted to go into kind of nonprofit work or use my skills for good instead of evil. And having the opportunity to work for the government and particularly work in the aid area really opened my eyes and just something struck a chord in me. And I said, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. And so I've been really lucky. I've been able to take my legal background and apply it to the third sector. So I bounced around the government a little bit with the aid organization and then also doing oversight. I worked with a few inspectors general where I was doing some oversight investigations, compliance work that way. And then I left the government and I went right into international NGOs and other kind of small, medium, large size charities. I've done everything from be out in the field handing out blankets and biscuits and buckets to being back in the headquarters, managing large multi-million-dollar grants, ensuring that we have compliance, rolling out risk strategies, risk awareness efforts, doing ethics and integrity training, all of that. And it's been a really great career so far. I love that I've been able to live in different places, work with different people, and see sort of the third sector from where it starts to where it ends, out in the field with beneficiaries and participants. So yeah, I'm living the dream, as people might say, although a lot of people might not describe doing compliance work as the dream. But my point of view is this. I've always sort of been in a support function as a lawyer. You're at a support function, and I don't mind that at all. In fact, the way I like to look at my work is if I'm doing it well, then that means that our programs and our activities are going to be as best supported as possible, and we're going to be able to provide the most positive impact for our beneficiaries and participants. And so I really do enjoy being in a support role, making sure that we are doing the best we can for our beneficiaries out in the field. And I feel good at night going to bed knowing that I'm doing my best to make sure that our field staff and anybody else who is working out there can do their best too. So that's a little bit about me.
I love that. And as people will have detected, not the sort of archetypal compliance officer. I think your personality and your passion for what you do bounces through. And I wondered, can you talk a little bit about the sort of risk and compliance challenges? Why do you need risk and compliance for the sector you're in? Can you talk a little bit about that and what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So the third sector, and if I refer to the third sector, I'm talking about nonprofits, charities, NGOs, non-governmental organizations. The reason that term came up was because you've got the public sector with governments, you've got the private sector, your typical businesses, for profits, and then we have the third sector. The third sector is a really interesting, it's been around forever, right? But when it comes to risk and compliance, it's a really interesting time to be working in this sector because we're bringing up the rear, so to speak. Governments and private sector have really been in this, particularly the financial sector, or if you're looking at chemicals, oil and gas, pharmaceuticals, they've been under regulatory and compliance constraint for such a long time. And typically something bad happens, the government reacts, and then private sector has to react to that. The third sector, we've sort of sat back quietly eating our popcorn and watching everybody kind of go through these painful machinations. But donors now are moving into that space as well. I mean, obviously, the large governmental donors have to report back to their parliaments, their congresses, whoever's holding the purse strings, and say, yes, the money, the taxpayer money that we are giving to whatever organization is not being used for human trafficking, or it's not being used to fund terrorism. And so more and more compliance requirements are being placed on the third sector, not necessarily just from government donors, but also from private foundations. They want to be able to say the money that we are giving these organizations is accounted for and it's being used in the right way. And so the third sector is now trying to catch up. But one of the things that I think is really great about the third sector is because we're a little bit late to the party, we are able to learn from what has worked and what has not worked in, for example, the private sector. And we can skip over the, red, yellow, and green boxes. Please don't even get me started on how much I hate risk matrices. We can maybe not spend so much time on a massive, never-ending risk register. And we can maybe focus on things that we're discovering now are more effective for creating risk awareness and risk management. The other challenge that we have in the third sector is we are typically low resourced or no resourced. And donors are adding more and more requirements to our grants and to the donations that we receive, but we're not necessarily getting more and more resources to comply with that. So, we are having to do more with less, as always, in the third sector. But I think that if we start looking at it in a creative way, we'll be able to meet those demands and exceed those demands and make sure that the resources that we're given are fully accounted for and we are an accountable organization, but we're also still able to really create that positive impact for beneficiaries and participants.
That's fascinating. What you're painting there is a picture of quite a lot of unpredictability and quite a few challenges that might not lend themselves to kind of strict codification. So how do you think about getting a handle on that, managing the balance between strict rules that you're going to need to follow and principles that you're going to need to put in place?
Yeah, that's a great question, Christian. I mean, a lot of times inherently in third sector, particularly in the humanitarian sector where you're responding to crises, war, natural disasters, things like that, it's a very fluid working environment and it's quite dynamic. We all know that risk is dynamic inherently. Risk is never static, which again is part of the reason why I hate risk matrices because they're just a snapshot in time. They're not really super helpful. But, I think in the third sector, what we try and do is sort of codify and develop easily repeatable ways of working for the things that we can, and then really try and train people around decision making for the things that we can't. One of the things that I try and emphasize when I'm working with organizations is, waivers are not a bad thing. You can't possibly develop a procedure, a process, or a policy that's going to cover every single environment that we're going to run into as an organization. And so making sure that people understand that they can use their judgment, waivers are available, a very simple one-page waiver explaining why you couldn't follow this process and who approved it. Fine, that's great. Put it in the file, move on. Because a lot of times with third sector organizations, and again, in the humanitarian sector, we are really time constrained. We need to be able to get into a place to get blankets, biscuits, and buckets to people. We need to be able to respond to something that's happening in real time and moving quickly. And so, having a 10-person approval process that's going to take 3 months to get something to happen is just not going to work in that environment. Now, that being said, again, you have to have at least, some internal controls that are in place so that you can demonstrate accountability. For large donors, a lot of times, large donors are looking for organizations who have two things. They are responsive and responsible. Responsive is the easy part, right? Responsive is the programming that you run. Do you provide healthcare for people? Do you do education programming? Are you doing gender programming, cash-based transfers, whatever it is that your core programming is? Are you working with animals, things like that? That's responsive. If a donor is looking at you because they want to help support your programming, you're responsive. That's the fun part. That's where your programs team is going to come up with something really interesting, and your funders and donors are going to get excited about it. The other side of that coin is the responsible. Donors and funders want to make sure that the organization they're working with is also responsible. And that's where the risk awareness, the compliance, and all of those things come in as well. And so, what we want to make sure is we have a good balance of those two things as much as we possibly can. I do believe that having some core policies in place so that you can show your donor, at least in the beginning, look, we are creating, or we have an environment where safeguarding, for example, children and vulnerable adults is something that we talk to our staff about, people are aware of. Corruption, fraud, a lot of the environments where third sector organizations are working in are ripe for corruption and fraud. Look, we have a policy on that. This is something we talk to our staff about. But we know that policies aren't going to be the silver bullet, and we have to do more than that. That's where it becomes quite tricky in the third sector, because your resource constraints and it doesn't really allow you to do some of the fun kind of training or things like that other organizations might be able to do. But again, it's still something that is there that we have to deal with in the third sector, and we have to deal with on a limited budget.
One of the things I think is interesting is that inherently what you're doing is good. And so there's this concept in behavioral science of sort of moral licensing, which is I can justify certain behaviors because of other behaviors. And so one of the things I think is interesting, not that I'm accusing the people you're working with of sort of doing good and bad at the same time, but if I compared it to another environment where you would sort of say, well, I understand why I need to follow the rules. In this case, you're ultimately trying to do good. And so that, I imagine, could lead to situations where people, they're not breaking rules deliberately, but they're trying to deliver a good outcome. And so the rationale for how you might approach certain rules could be very different to another situation.
So what you're calling moral licensing, there is a term called the halo effect that you see happening. I don't want to say often, but you certainly see it happening in the third sector. And typically where you see this happening has to do with staff management. A lot of times organizations are saying, look at all the good that we're doing. We are helping, pregnant women and small children. We are helping animals. We're helping old people, whatever it is. And then they abuse the crap out of their staff, right? There is bullying going on. There is harassment. There is discrimination. There's just all around bad management, whatever it is, and then you've got fraud and corruption, all those things. But there is this sense sometimes in the third sector where, organizations, we're doing all this good in the world so we can cut some corners. We can do these bad things because look at our halo. Look at all the wonderful stuff. Now, you can look in the news, particularly a lot, recently in the past, 5 or so years, the road to good intentions is littered with the carcasses of well-regarded organizations really getting ground into the road because of the Me Too movement, because of gender discrimination, harassment, sexual harassment, abuse of personnel. So, a lot of times it's really less so that I see in the compliance world, right? I mean, maybe you have somebody who's cutting corners on a procurement because they want to be able to get plastic tarps somewhere faster. And so they cut a corner here and there. But what I see the moral licensing more is the interactions with staff. And that's really heartbreaking because it doesn't have to be that way, but it certainly is something that happens in the third sector.
And I guess that also brings it to the unpredictability of it. And you've talked before about the fact that you're dealing in a very, very challenging environment, need to respond quickly. Those dynamics that you talked about would exist even if there wasn't the sort of high pressure situations. I'm assuming it can be even worse. So if I think about the challenges that you're facing versus that people might be facing in I guess the first or the second sector, this is a lot tougher, right? The more I think about these dynamics, the more challenging it is.
So yeah, we can move away from the humanitarian sector and let's just talk about the development, the international development, or, where we're thinking more about systems, we're thinking more about education or health, things like that. Or even just maybe the charity shop or the charity that's down the road from you, whether it's an animal charity or a charity working with elderly people or a food bank, right? A lot of times the challenge isn't necessarily with, I have to get on a plane and jump out of the back and deliver water to people. But maybe you're dealing a lot with volunteers, right? Volunteers, you never, you can do your best to do volunteer screening, but you sort of never know what you're going to get with volunteers. And a lot of organizations rely heavily on volunteers because they don't have the funds for staff, or maybe, you don't need to hire a lot of staff. You just need these part-time volunteers who can surge when you want to surge and things like that. But there's a lot of uncertainty and there's a whole range of risks that come with managing a volunteer staff, whether it's the very obvious things like making sure they get a police check, making sure that they're not going to do inappropriate things with your participants or your beneficiaries, especially if they're children. But also, volunteers come to the work with their own point of view. A lot of them are very passionate about the subject matter that your organization will be working in. So they're passionate about children, they're passionate about animals, whatever it is, the environment, that's a big one now. But they may have a different point of view on the best way to implement that activity or that program that your organization has designed. And that can be very unpredictable as well. So how do you find volunteers? How do you select them? How do you train them? And how do you make sure that they are going to be the best representation for your organization? How do you identify and manage those risks? That's absolutely an area that third sector folks have to be thinking about.
And are the majority of people that you're dealing with, whether they're volunteers or employed, are these people that are doing it for life, or is the typical tendency for people to come into it for a shorter period of time? How does that work?
I think it really depends. I think you see those stories about the 83-year-old who has donated blood once a month since they were 25 years old, right? I mean, there are people who, for a third sector, a charity organization, that really means something to them for whatever reason. They're dedicated and you have them for life. And then there's folks who come and go depending on what's going on in the world. If you look at the United States right now, access to abortion, healthcare, things like that is a big deal. And so you're going to see a surge in volunteers, people who want to work more in that area because they see that it's under threat, or they see that it's an area that, really needs more help right now. And then maybe those people, once they see that the situation is under control, might move on to something else that they are passionate about. Or, they might volunteer with 2 or 3 different things. Maybe they foster animals in their house because they're passionate about animals. Maybe they lead their son or daughter's scout troop. And then, maybe they donate funds to a healthcare provider organization. It really depends on the person and what speaks to them and what they're passionate about. We love those people, right? We love those people who find time in their life to give back. And even if it's just one, and even if it's just a little bit of time, no organization is going to say no to that. But the more time and resources folks have to give to the third sector, whatever your interest is, definitely we encourage people to do that.
I was just thinking, if you look at businesses, there will be certain industries that attract a certain type of person. So banking would be a really obvious example. And what was interesting in the way you were just depicting that, I could imagine you've got a very broad range of people, again, with, thinking back to the challenges you're talking about, with different perspectives, different objectives, different desires, different rationale for, wanting to do something. And so again, from a human perspective, you're dealing with probably a much broader range of people, I would imagine, than you might see in say, industry or politics.
Yeah, I think with any sector, you're going to have people who are self-selecting. With the third sector, a lot of times you're going to have people who are leading with their heart and not necessarily with their head or their bank account, for that matter. They go into this work. Again, I was a lawyer. I graduated from law school. I took the bar. I passed the bar. I could have gone to a big firm and helped people argue over money and property and stuff. But I was like, that's not going to help me get up in the morning. I'm not going to feel passionate about that. So
Right.
People who go into charity work are doing it. They lead with the heart a lot of times. But there's been a great discussion in the sector lately about paying a more competitive salary because all the studies show if you hire better people, you're going to have better outcomes. Now, that's not saying that good people don't work in the third sector. There's tons of good people who work in the third sector, and they do so knowing that they could make more money in the private sector. But what it might do is actually bring more credibility, and it might bring more recognition to people who choose to work in this sector because the salaries are becoming more competitive. It's a broader conversation with funders and donors, though, right? Because every funder and donor wants to see 99 cents of every dollar going to a program and 1 cent going to overhead and staff training and all of that. And it just doesn't work that way. I mean, anybody who's listening to the podcast today and you are a donor, you're a funder, whatever, please understand that organizations are doing everything they can to maximize the impact of their programming, but you cannot do that by cutting to the bone staffing, right? You don't want to cut to the bone staff continuing education opportunities. You don't want to cut to the bone staff benefits and leave, right? You don't necessarily have to provide, massages for staff pets. That's, something like that, or all you can eat cereal bar all the time, right? But we want to make sure that we're taking care of our staff because they're the ones who are taking care of the programming. And so putting more money into salaries, putting money into performance benefits packages, things like that is only going to be good for everybody involved. And any organization that is only putting 5 cents into programming and the other 95 into their pockets, that's a fraudulent organization. So I'm not even going to go down that road and talk. But we really do have to think about how we are looking at compensation for third sector folks and what really is the most impactful ratio of donations to performance, because what we're finding now with a lot of studies is we don't have to be as thin on the organization side as possible. And that's good for somebody like me in risk and compliance, because then that means that that can provide a little bit more, just a tiny bit more resourcing so that we can really spend the time to develop a better structure around things like our whistleblowing tools, right? Maybe we do need to outsource to a third sector or a private sector system so that we can have proper neutral receiving of complaints. There's a lot of companies that do that now, but just something like that to think about when you are donating or when people are looking at what are the ratios. It's okay for organizations to spend more money on their staff and their operations. It's actually going to help make more impactful and more accountable programs at the end of the day.
That's exactly where I was going with that previous question, because I think there's something fascinating about the inherently contradictory piece, which is we're appalled when bad things happen. They're out of control, and it makes the headlines as sort of, bad behavior at charity. It's almost like bad behavior at banking. So headlines, this really shouldn't be happening. This is awful. And yet at the same time, we have that contradictory thing of like, well, I want all of my money to go to whichever cause. Or I don't like this idea of the money being siphoned off into something else that feels like, overpaid bureaucrats. And that's the interesting thing is we want both of those pieces. And as you've rightly identified, that's just not possible. So we have to be ready to invest in that infrastructure. But there's this inherent contradiction as to how people look at the situation.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think the third sector is starting to do a better job kind of framing that conversation and having that conversation, not only with large sort of institutional or foundational donors, but with the public, right? I mean, you've got all of these charity review sites that are out there. I think, one is called Charity Navigator or something else. And, and it says, what's the ratio? What's the ratio of for programming to operations? And everyone's looking for a low ratio, but a low ratio doesn't necessarily make, your organization any better. I mean, I can think of organizations that I've worked with or I know about from colleagues where, for example, they are sending people into war zones, sending people to Yemen, sending people to Syria, sending people to Iraq with no preparation, with no support, saying, okay, well, when you land, we're going to have a car for you. You're going to go to a guest house. And that's it, right? I mean, that's then when you start hearing about these awful stories of an aid worker being killed because they weren't necessarily sent to this very volatile environment, properly trained or properly equipped, right? I mean, when I was working in the field, luckily I've worked in fairly calm places, but you want to make sure, for example, that the guest house that your staff is staying in has fire extinguishers, right? You want to make sure that the guest house that your staff is
Right.
staying in have shelter in place boxes that has enough food and water where if something were to happen outside, if, for example, there were protests or if there was a coup or whatever it is, that your staff can take care of themselves for 1, 2, 3 weeks, whatever it is that you've done your assessment to require. Third sector organizations have a duty of care towards their staff and their volunteers. And it's something that there was actually a few international legal cases a few years ago about some staff who were killed and their families brought cases against the organization. And the courts found against the organization, saying that they did not fulfill their duty of care towards their staff because they did not prepare them appropriately before they dropped them in these locations. And so that is a huge risk. Again, we're kind of going back to the humanitarian side, but that is a huge risk that organizations need to think about. If we move to the non-humanitarian side and go back to the environmental organization that might just be down the street from your house, again, those organizations have a duty of care to their staff to ensure that they're not in a hostile working environment, they're not being bullied, they're not being discriminated against. They have a duty of care towards their privacy and data protection. So organizations, while we want everyone to focus on the good work and the programs that are being run and the activities, you have to keep in mind that they function under a lot of the same regulatory and compliance requirements that large corporations do, and they really have the limited budget to do it. So we have to get creative, we have to be aware of it, and it can be really challenging sometimes for the third sector.
That creativity point, I think, is really interesting because when we look at there's that basic principle of with limited resources, we often can become, there's a need to be more creative. And I'm fascinated to explore how that happens, because what I've always found interesting when I've spoken to people that work in your sector, there's kind of because you recognize that you've got these pressures on you in terms of particularly budgets being an obvious example, but also just things like access to systems and so some of the things that in a commercial context would be naturally provided, would exist within the organization because that would be a sort of no-brainer. Well, it's a bit more challenging when you're in budget constraints. But it seems to me that creativity, you're likely to come up with ideas that actually could be relevant the other way. So I'm always looking there and saying, actually, I think we're in of necessity, it's an innovation hotbed, a little bit like startups, where you sort of have to hustle a little bit to make things happen.
I mean, yeah, but I can guarantee you that if you talk to anybody in the third sector, they'd rather not be in that position. They would much rather have just a little bit more resources so we don't have to be so innovative. But no, I mean, I absolutely hear your point, Christian. Look, there's organizations I know that, again, I've worked with and I have colleagues in who, their entire finance system is run on Excel spreadsheets, right? Would they love to be able to have a proper and kind of more robust financial accounting system? Absolutely. Can they afford it? Or even if they could afford it, a lot of times organizations will say, we could get this financial accounting system or we could put more money towards our programming. And they are willing to continue to hobble through and suffer through an Excel spreadsheet because they want to put more money towards their programming. So it really goes both ways. But I would say that, look, for the small to medium-sized organizations that are out there, and we're not talking about the massive ones that everybody knows about, but the small to medium-sized organizations, you have to look at your strategy and you have to say, do we want to grow? Right? Do we want to grow? Do we want to exponentially grow our impacts with the programming that we're doing? Or do we want to move into a related but sort of slightly different area for programming? If you want to grow, if you want to reach more participants and beneficiaries, if you want to change and slightly adjust your programming and expand into different areas, you need to invest. And it can be really hard and it can be painful, but you need to invest in your operations, in your support side, because that is the foundation upon which you are going to be able to expand and reach more beneficiaries and participants. The other thing too is if you want to have a seat at the table with the larger donors, whether it's a government donor or whether it's larger foundations, family foundations, well-known foundations, whatever it is, again, going back to that responsive and responsible ratio, You're going to be responsive. The programming that you're going to do is going to be fantastic. People are going to be talking about it. They want to be part of it. But you have to demonstrate that you're responsible. And this is where we come back to, not just your financial accounting systems and your compliance reporting to the Charities Commission or whoever it is, but, do you have a safeguarding program, right? Not only where people are aware of what they should and shouldn't do with children and vulnerable populations, but safeguarding of your staff, going back to the duty of care conversation. What does somebody do if there's bullying in your organization? What does somebody do if they think that there's fraud? What does your whistleblowing program look like? I tell you, the ones that drive me nuts are when you go to an organization, everything is really slick packaged. They're doing great. They're winning all these awards. It's wonderful. And you look at the whistleblowing program and it's one paragraph, right? And it
Right.
basically says, if you see something wrong, tell your supervisor. If you don't want to tell your supervisor, tell the CEO. And if you don't want to tell the CEO, tell the chairman of the board. Like, give me a break, right? I mean, let's think about power dynamics. Let's think about, that's not going to work very well. And a lot of times those things are neglected and not really well thought through. And those are the things that can completely crash and burn your organization. So, yeah, look, if you're small, if you are a local organization that is trying to, for example, clean up your local neighborhood and you gather together once a month with bags and sticks and you're picking up the trash, that's one thing, right? And those organizations, you don't need a whole lot of stuff. But if you want to grow and you really want to increase your impact, think about those types of elements, your whistleblowing programs, not just for your staff too, but also for your participants. What happens if a participant is doing an activity with your organization and something strange happens, something bad happens, a volunteer says something inappropriate to them? Again, think about the power dynamics of the people that you're working with. Your beneficiaries, your participants are going to be low power. They're the ones that are there to get help. If they're being taken advantage of, you have to provide them with a safe way to be able to speak up and speak out. And again, that's another risk that a lot of organizations sort of gloss over. But donors and funders are really starting to ask for more information about that, and it can become a compliance challenge.
Fascinating stuff. My mind is kind of racing now because I love having these sorts of conversations because you think you've sort of understood in this, like, oh my, there's another level to what you're talking about. And I wondered how you think about communicating risk and compliance issues internally, because the more I'm listening to you, the more I'm seeing that there's just a huge range of things that could go wrong. And back to my sort of simple analysis, potentially far more than you might expect to see in the average organization and less resources to deal with it. And so sort of being on top of that forward agenda, how do you even start to think about communicating those things? Because you've just highlighted a range of issues, which is just scratching the surface of all of the subjects that I'm sure you've looked at in the past. So how are you communicating and how are you staying on top of it yourself? How does one prioritize it?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. Like you were saying, there's so many layers. And as they say in the third sector, it goes to 11, right? I mean, like we are nonstop all the time.
Yeah.
There's a couple different ways that you can slice and dice it. There is the easy way, the checklist way, right? We go to our grants and we say, what are the compliance elements in the grants? We create a checklist and we build our compliance and then sort of risk awareness environment around that checklist in the grant, right? You can see that very clearly in a lot of organizations focus on fraud, and more recently, organizations focused on safeguarding, and even more recently, organizations focusing on data protection and privacy, right? So, a lot of times in the third sector, the direction is really coming from the donor because the donor is saying, this is what's required of you. We want to see reports on this quarterly or whatever it is. Again, though, donors are not really providing a lot of the resources. So for the additional reporting that they're requiring, there's no additional resources to do it. So, that would be sort of the base level way of doing it. The way that, I think more organizations should do it. And when I advise organizations, this is sort of my point of view is sort of objective centered, right? I think you have to have a balance between the compliance elements, but you also need to look at what your organization's objectives are and whether it's your high level strategic or objectives or whether it's the objectives of your particular program or project. Focusing first on what your objectives are and then working your way out from there and saying, okay, if this is objective one, and maybe my project has 3 objectives. Objective one, right? Now, what risks could happen, right? What threats could happen that will prevent us from achieving this objective? And what I find is that if you get your project team around the table, they're really smart people. There's amazingly smart people who have decades of experience, particularly technical experience, who are working in these organizations. Set them around a table and say, this is our objective. What are the things, the threats that could happen that will prevent us from achieving our objective? And start thinking through it that way. I actually have a tool that I like to use. It's sort of a modified mind map where we put the objective in the middle and then we have circles around it that say these are the threats, right? And we draw little lines and say, okay. Then from the threats, where you pick each threat and you say, what are the reasons behind these threats? Why do these threats happen? A really good example from the international development world is I'm in a country, I'm trying to run an education program. And in order for me to run these different activities, I have to get approval from the local government every time I want to run one of these activities. Well, the person that the functionary for the local government, there's turnover. Maybe they turn over once a year, maybe they turn over every 6 months, but it changes depending on who you're talking to behind that window. Well, as an organization, I don't have control over that, right? But that's a reason why that's a threat, because I won't be able to run my program unless I get this approval. So one of the things that you can do then is list and say, well, okay, we have to make sure we get this approval. And now, why wouldn't we get the approval? So then once you list your threats, then you say, what are the preparations that I need to do to monitor or mitigate the threats so I can manage the risk, so I can achieve my objective? So using that example with the government functionary, right? Well, maybe sometimes my office isn't as good as it should be about submitting these requests for approval on time. So that's something that I have control over. I can do a better job as the project manager, making sure that we have reminders set and making sure that I'm following up with my teams that they've submitted the approval on time. But if the functionary behind the window has changed and has no idea who I am, what my organization does, it can take even longer for that approval to happen. So one of the things that we try and build in is active monitoring, right? So if I know my team on the ground knows that there's been turnover at that particular ministry or at that particular office, we can make sure that we're submitting our approval with even more advance notice. Or maybe we're sending our country director or our project manager to go and meet with the new functionary to make sure you can talk to them, they understand who we are, and why what we're doing is going to be good for their community, right? So there's ways that you can then take your objective, go through that process of what's the risk, what are the threats that are going to prevent us from achieving the objective, what are the causes of that threat, and then what can we do to make sure that we're not going to fall down that road. If you start with your objectives, I find that that's actually a really great way to then build out your risk awareness and then also feed into your compliance, because what you want to do is integrate your compliance and your risk awareness into your ways of working. I believe in policies. I know some other people might have a different point of view on policies. I believe in policies as the foundation of your compliance and risk environment because you need reference material, right? You have to have something that kind of clearly sets out the boundaries, along with a very robust waiver program. I believe in waivers too, but you have to have the policies. But if you're doing this objective-centered risk approach to your very dynamic programs and your very dynamic environments that you're working in, you can then take the results of that analysis and feed it back into your policies and your compliance environment, and it will help make that environment actually more dynamic too. There's this kind of misconception that compliance is very rigid and written in stone and very standardized and it can never change. And I think that that's a really bad point of view to come from with compliance. I think that compliance is also dynamic, but it has to be an informed dynamicism. It has to be an informed dynamic because compliance is something that you don't necessarily want changing all the time, but it can change. And there's nothing that says that it can't. So long answer there. I mean, I think that for organizations, the first thing they're going to probably start doing is what are my requirements from my donors and funders, or even my regulatory, right? The Charities Commission, for example, in the UK. But I think a more dynamic and a more impactful way to look at risks is to kind of start with your objectives and work your way out from there and then build your ways of working around risk awareness, risk monitoring, or active monitoring and risk mitigation.
I love that, because what you've just described is something known as a pre-mortem, which is often used. Post-mortems happen when someone's died. Pre-mortem, the idea being you work out what could go wrong beforehand. And so you get people together and say, okay, imagine this has failed. Why has it failed? And let's explore the reasons why. So that's exactly what you're talking about there, which is sort of just thinking creatively about, look, what do we know in the real world could waylay us to our objectives? And I love that, because it's super engaging in the sense that you're not talking in a fantasy hypotheticals. It's like, okay, based on our experience, let's think about this, and we can start to sort of recognize what's there and catch it before it happens. And so I think it's bringing risk management to compliance and combining those two disciplines. And so I really like the way you articulated that. And the bit I like as well, it is fun, right? It's much more interesting kind of engaging in discussions and thought processes before things happen than having to clean up a mess after they've happened.
Absolutely. And I do think that one of the things when I introduce this into organizations, I usually get a really great response because you see the light bulb go on, right? Because I usually do like about a 2-hour workshop. And, sort of the first hour is, okay, this is, ISO 31000, for example. This is what risk is. This is,
Right.
this is not just Sabrina making this up, right? Because a lot of times people are like, who's this crazy person and what is she telling me? And I'm like, no. There's a whole sort of science and philosophy and art and black magic behind this, right? But now let's take the elements that, we think are going to work for us here in the third sector. And then sort of the second hour, I do a hands-on thing, right? I will take the objectives from the organization, whatever they are, whether it's a team objectives, whether it's project objectives, whether it's, high-level strategy objectives, and I break people into groups, and then we go through the exercise and we say, okay, start with your objective. Because so many times people think of risk management as a long list of awful things that could happen. And the problem with risk matrices and risk registers is that's exactly what it is. A lot of times with risk management, it's not connected to decision making and it's not connected to objectives. And that's the other piece of advice I give organizations too. I say, look, what you're doing right now, sit here and ask yourself, how does this inform decision making? And how does this relate to my objectives? And if you cannot explain it to me like I'm a 2-year-old, stop doing it. It doesn't make any sense. It's a waste of your time. And you are in a resource constrained environment as it is, right? So focusing on the objectives, tying it to decision making, right? I mean, risk appetite statements, again, don't even get me started on those. Boards might really love them and auditors might tick your box, but it doesn't actually help you make better decisions. And it doesn't actually help you, achieve your objectives. So, I have to give Tim Leach a shout out because I started out with reading a lot of his work, looking at his approach, and I've taken some of Tim's core thinking and I've adjusted it for the third sector and tried to simplify it, again, using an Excel spreadsheet, because an Excel spreadsheet's available no matter where you are, whether how far out in the field you are, whether you're in headquarters. And really then taking this objective-centered risk management approach and building it into project management. Once it's built into how your PMs are going to be managing their activities or their projects or their programs, then it's built in, right? It's not I have to get my risk register and blow it off every
Right.
quarter and talk about it. It's built into how you're doing it, because if you're not going to be able to achieve your objective, it means you're not managing your risk well. So let's just do it while we're managing the project, and we don't have to create a whole nother tool to do it later on at the end of the quarter.
I love that idea of embedding it, because I think one of the reasons that compliance and risk management, all these sorts of things feel kind of clunky is because they are, right? They're sort of just bolted on afterwards. So here's the activity, and then, oh, crap, we better choose something to make sure it's good. Is that within the rules? Is that mitigated? Let's bolt all this stuff on afterwards. That's why I think compliance is known as the business prevention unit, because it's bolted on afterwards. It sort of slows down. Whereas if you've embedded it in the first place, then one, you're much less likely to have issues. But two, it doesn't feel like this alien thing that's been foisted on the organization.
Absolutely. Built in instead of bolted on is something that I find myself saying ad nauseum. But yeah, I mean, build it in. And the thing is, too, is build it in, and then your staff, or you're going to have a much higher percentage of staff compliance because it's simply built into the ways of working as opposed to something that's bolted on afterwards. one of the areas where we see a lot of bolt on is data protection and privacy, particularly because of GDPR, and people are still scared of it. But don't be scared of it. It's not that scary. But people are thinking bolt on when it comes to protection and privacy, as opposed to built into our data handling. An example that drives me nuts is you have a form that you're asking people to fill out, and it's got 15 different fields. And really, the office that's using the form is using 4 of those 15 fields. And you go, well, why are we still asking for these other fields? It's like, well, we've always done it that way. Oh, we just, this is just the way the form is. And it's like, well, stop, right? I mean, there was an organization that I remember talking to a colleague about where, when someone was hired, they had like a 6-page health form that they had to fill out. And, people were told, oh, well, you need this to get the health insurance. And then somebody asked the question, well, why? And HR went to the insurance company and said, well, why do we have to fill all this in? And the insurance company said, we don't need all of that. In fact, you don't even send that to us, right? I mean, so it's just like, ask why, right? And look, instead of having a 6-page form, you could have a half a page form, and it makes it more efficient for everybody. And then you're not handling people's health information or whatever it is. So, go back, look at your forms, make sure what you're collecting is actually what you're using. And if you're not using it, stop collecting it. But that's the built-in element of risk awareness, risk management, and compliance.
I think it's fascinating when we look at processes. It's kind of like, well, why are you asking for this? Well, either because I can, which is a terrible reason for doing it, or it's like, well, that's what we have always asked for, and we will continue to do that. Like, you wouldn't, it's fascinating. It's previous conversations you and I have had. It's like, you wouldn't do that in any other context. If you were doing an activity and you had aid workers on the ground, for example, and it wasn't working, you wouldn't keep pursuing it. You'd be going, let's try something else. And I think the same, we need to have that same level of dynamism with risk and compliance, is to sort of think about, are the processes fit for purpose? Do they make sense? And if they don't, we should absolutely stop doing them.
I agree. And I think, what did they say? The definition of insanity is, doing the same thing, but harder, and it's not working or whatever it is. But I think there's 2 sides to this coin, right? I think we need to make sure that we have staff and volunteers and people who are working who are thinking creatively and feel empowered, right? They feel enabled to be like, wait a minute, this isn't working. But in order to have that, you have to have this term psychological safety, right? You have to have an organizational culture where people feel comfortable speaking up and speaking out. And, everyone kind of says, oh, I had I'm not going to say what organization, but I had an organization that I worked for where we were talking about enhancing or changing the whistleblowing tool.
Yeah.
And, I went through the presentation, why this is important. These are some options, low cost, no cost, whatever. And the CEO goes, well, I don't really know if we want to do this because then it's going to call more attention to our compliance. And I just sat there and I was like, I don't even know how to respond to this right now, right? But, the thing is that people look at speak up, speak out as only negative, right? We're only going to get complaints. We're only going to get negative things. But if you really genuinely have speak up, speak out, you're going to have some really amazing, positive, and creative solutions to some of the pain points that you're feeling as well. People will feel enabled, right? And engaged and have the ability to raise their voice and say, hey, I saw this over here. It wasn't working. Here's maybe a better way we can do it. It doesn't mean that there's fraud. It doesn't mean that there's, harassment or anything like that. It just means this isn't working. This is a pain point. Let's come up with a better way to do it. If you have an environment where people are shut down and have their heads down and they feel that if they raise their voice, they're going to be made fun of, belittled, even worse, retaliated against, lose their job, you're certainly not going to get the bad stuff, and you're not going to get any of the good stuff either. So it really goes both ways. The onus is on organizations to create these environments where, if you want to get your fraud reporting, make sure people have an anonymous way to do it, not to the CEO or the chairman of the board, right? But also, if you want to have innovation, you need to have an environment where people are willing to speak up as well. So it goes both ways.
Love it. What an amazing note. I could keep talking to you forever, Sabrina, but time is against us. Before I let you go, tell my listeners about your podcast, because although it may not be something that they would naturally listen to, one of the things I always think fascinating is finding different contexts. And as they'll have heard, you have a very inquiring and curious mind, and I want to send people over in your direction. So tell us about the show and where they can find it.
Yeah, definitely. So the podcast that I have is called Tolerable Risk, and it's about threats and opportunities in the third sector. And it's really talking about how charities, nonprofits, NGOs, low, no resource organizations can manage risk. So, maybe some of your folks who are listening are in a startup environment, maybe, or they're in a small organization. Some of the people that I have on my show might be of interest to them. But we really do come at it from a third sector point of view. And you can find the podcast pretty much anywhere you get podcasts. I'm on Apple and Spotify and Google and all those other places. And you can also find me on LinkedIn. Sabrina Segal, Segal is my last name. And I love to connect with folks on LinkedIn as well. I love to have new conversations, even if you're not in the third sector, but you're interested in just connecting, talking about risk, anything else. Love to have it. So please reach out, and always open to chatting with folks.
Amazing. Sabrina, thank you so much.
Thank you, Christian. This has been so much fun.
So that's it for this episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Sabrina for appearing and to you for listening. To find out more about Sabrina and her Tolerable Risk podcast, have a look in the show notes. There are links to both there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. To catch up with previous episodes, visit humanriskpodcast.com. I'll be back very soon with another episode of this show, but in the meantime, stay safe and thanks for listening.